Hello, everyone. This is Ann Walhout, Association Coordinator of PPRA. Thank you for joining us today for the FP2 and PPRA webinar, Green Roads Ahead, the Future of Our Roads. Over the past few years, FP2 and PPRA have partnered together on Earth Day to discuss the current pavement condition of our roads and what happens if we do not do anything. With our continued partnership, our presenters today will look to the future on the sustainability and environmental savings of pavement preservation and recycling treatments on our roads. Before we begin, we would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We do have you all on mute for today's webinar, and we'll be using the question function on the right-hand side of your screen for any questions you may have during the presentation. Any questions that do come in for our first presenter today, Charles Small, will be sent to him via email after the webinar concludes, and his responses will be made available to all attendees in the coming days. Any questions for our other presenters will be answered at the end of the webinar as time allows. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and will be provided via email to all registered attendees. We will now turn the webinar over to Jim Moulthrop, FP2's Executive Director, to provide more information on FP2 and introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Ruth. And it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers for today's webinar. I think most of you know that FP2, otherwise known as the Foundation for Pavement Preservation, is a nonprofit trade association. We represent contractors, material suppliers, equipment manufacturers, and other people affiliated with pavement preservation. And we continue to advocate for pavement preservation at all levels of government. So for our first speaker today, let me introduce Mr. Charles Small. He is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs with the U.S. Department of Transportation. And in this role, he serves as the primary liaison for state, county, and local elected officials in outreach and engagement strategy with non-federal stakeholders. In previous roles, he has served as the Director of Federal Affairs and National Engagement for the City of Los Angeles, the Associate Director of Federal Affairs for the State of New York, and at the Office of the United States Trade Representative in the Obama administration. Welcome, Mr. Charles.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, and great to be with you on Earth Day. Just to give you a little insight, I think, on how far I think we've come. Literally a year ago today, when I was working for Mayor Garcetti and the city of Los Angeles, it was my role on this actual very day to deposit a check into the city's bank account that we were receiving from the Department of Treasury via the CARES Act. And that check, I'll always remember this, because that check was for $694 million. And you know, when you're handling a transaction of that size, you can get a bit antsy. And my wife pleasantly reminded me that also on Earth Day is our wedding anniversary. And so she was very curious to see, and she was wondering when she was going to get her $694 million check that day. Unfortunately, I only had one, and it definitely had to go to the city of Los Angeles. But I think it just shows where we were in the entire incredible uncertainty of the CARES of trying to implement the CARES Act to now having met the president's goal of a renewed goal of 200 million shots in arms to have half of adults in the United States now vaccinated. I think, you know, we are definitely starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and that's very exciting for me personally, as someone in particular who loves traveling and who loves getting on airplanes and flying across the country and across the world, and certainly enjoys getting on our roadway system and being able to travel and drive to places like New York and you know, Raleigh, North Carolina, and other places that the family and our friends tend to go to up and down the eastern seaboard. But it also has created this situation where we have now been able to experience and get an interesting look at what our transit system, our transportation system would look like if the roads weren't congested. And I think, you know, it's great to be having conversations like this. And I do apologize that I do have to leave early because of some of our commitments to Earth Day. But I also feel a little bad too, because this would be a great conversation to have in person with Rocky. And I've seen a little bit of his presentation, and I find it very, very compelling. I'm not sure I agree with it 100%. But I am definitely I definitely would love to be able to be in person and have that rigorous intellectual debate, and maybe we'll have a little bit of it here. But really, what I want to tell you is highlight a couple things from what the president has proposed in the American Jobs Plan that I think have very interesting implications for our roadways and what the future of our roadways look like. I think we're definitely a little happy to see that the Republicans have countered with their own, or the Senate Republicans, I should say, have countered with their own infrastructure plan, and that we are actually now having a real debate and a real back and forth on infrastructure, and particularly transportation infrastructure. And I also am was very interested to see that there was some language in there on electric vehicles, which I think will have an incredibly strong impact on the future of our roads and the greening, hopeful greening of our system. In particular, the American Jobs Plan proposes $174 billion to install an EV charging network across the country, as well as to actually get electric vehicles into the garages and on the driveways of Americans across the country. And I think that represents an interesting and very important opportunity for the country to really deploy this technology in real strategic ways. I've had some incredible conversations with some deep red states about their EV charging plans along highways, and particularly along evacuation routes, to deal with the range anxiety that can come, particularly when you're in an emergency situation. But also, I think it will, our plan, the president's plan, will also be able to build a market that also not only that would be backed by the government, but also provides a great opportunity for the private sector to step in and meet the total need, which some of the data that I've seen suggests that we're going to need at least 3 to 4 million charging stations to hopefully meet the demand for electric vehicles when the market begins to mature. So I think that's one place where the American Jobs Plan is really going to be hopefully great for this idea of our roads and the future of them becoming greener. But I think one of the more interesting things is, and one thing that as I've been touring the country virtually, of course, we built this airplane virtually and are going to be flying it that way for a little while longer, I suspect, is on congestion. And congestion, I think it is well said by folks on both sides of the aisle, is not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It doesn't matter who you are, you're going to be affected by this as you get on the roadways. And what we've seen in the pandemic is that is a transportation system that has a lack of congestion. In my prior role, I had the good fortune of having a perfectly socially distanced office downtown here in Washington, D.C., in the McPherson Square area, if you are familiar with it. And it turned a 25-minute commute for me, even though I lived in the district then properly, into a 9-minute commute each day. And some of the data that I've seen indicates that trips to downtown DC were down 66% year over year over the course of this pandemic. And what I think that means is look, this future that is coming, this future in September that I think is really coming, when kids hopefully go back to school, and we start to really experience what this new form of transportation called broadband is going to do to rush hour and is going to do to our roadway system. I think it actually means that our congestion future is going to be a little bit different than it was pre-pandemic, and that actually there's going to be a real opportunity, and this might sound a bit counterintuitive. There's going to be actual real opportunity to not only double down on transit, but to actually really go all in, and that we will have an opportunity, and hopefully the American Jobs Plan can really spark this opportunity with the $85 billion we proposed for transit, as well as the $25 billion we proposed for transformative projects, to really think about how we can make our transit system in particular more equitable, and obviously certainly in our interests, in our values, more sustainable as well. I think one of the more interesting things about this pandemic, as we've thought about transportation, is and particularly transit systems and how it affects the roadways, is a lot of the bus rapid transit systems in particular that remained in place and that served essential workers, which tended to also serve communities of color. Those buses were still full. Those buses were still needed to get people to where they needed to go to their livelihoods, so they could do services that needed to be done to keep this economy running in the middle and through the course of this pandemic. One note, and I know this doesn't necessarily relate directly to roads, but I think that I find interesting from the DC area, is that if you're familiar with the Washington metro system, the Columbia Heights metro system was the 14th most used station pre-pandemic, and that was a pretty active metro station, pretty active community. It's also the heart of the Latino community in Washington D.C. Now it is the #1 used metro station in Washington D.C. and you have a ton of bus routes that go through there. You have a very vibrant a bus corridor along 14th Street with the 50 buses that run up and down 14th Street. So I really think what are the greening of our future, really, when I look at that, and I really look at it from the American Jobs Plan perspective, it actually represents a real opportunity for us, an opportunity in particular to make the transit system that I think Americans deserve, and certainly also we want to try to meet from an administration perspective the president's campaign promise to try to build transit systems for communities over 100,000 and make them reliable and obviously safe and available to our key labor markets and connecting them to downtowns and other job centers around the country. So that's one of the things that I'm really excited about. And we're also starting to see some interesting things from cities across the country, especially on bus rapid transit. I was chatting with some folks out in San Francisco about this today, where they're already starting to figure out ways to kind of capture, I'm not sure congestion gains is necessarily the right term, but where they're starting to capture that behavior change of, well, if the bus can come at a rapid pace, at a pace that I can rely on, I might actually take that bus on that road instead of driving to wherever I need to go. And I think that could be an interesting legacy of this pandemic, is that not only did it provide a moment for us to really invest in our transportation system in a very unique way through rail, through the modernization of our roads and bridges, but also I think this could be a really interesting and sneaky moment for buses. And of course, from our perspective, hopefully those buses are powered by clean energy. So in conclusion, I am really excited to see what the legacy of transportation will be post-pandemic. I think Rocky has some interesting data and thoughts to share on what that has looked like and what that could look like in the future. But for me, as someone who grew up as an Angelino and who grew up believing that a car was a source of freedom, I'm proud to say that I've gone to Los Angeles for the last 4 years, and I've only rented a car once. And there is an actual way to do transit and have it be a functional part of your life, even in a car-heavy place like LA. And hopefully that is an experience that we can start to build on throughout the country and really take advantage of our amazing roadway system and figure out how to I guess square that circle between transit and really building our economy. So thanks so much for letting me bend your ear a little bit. I probably went a little bit too long, but this is definitely a subject I'm a little passionate about, and I'm glad to pass it over to Rocky and hear his presentation right now.
Mr. Small, I really want to thank you for your comments today. I appreciate it. I know you've got a very, very heavy schedule today, and as was noted when we started, that anybody that has questions for you about your comments, they'll send them in, and we'll send them to you for response, and we'll send it back out to all the 191 people who are attending this webinar right now. So again, thank you very much for your time, and we appreciate it very much. Our next speaker is Rocky Moretti. Some of you have known Rocky over the years, but he is the Director of Policy and Research at TRIP and has been there since 1992. TRIP, I think you know, is the Road Information Program, is another way to say it, is a Washington, D.C. nonprofit, reports on a variety of transportation issues. Additionally, in 2007, he served on a blue ribbon panel of transportation experts on the future of the nation's surface transportation policy. And from 1998 to 2002, he served as the executive director of the Alliance for Clean Air and Transportation. He participates in numerous transportation forums, including the Transportation Research Board, the ENO Foundation, and the Federal Highway Administration. Rocky, thanks for joining us today, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that introduction, and I want to acknowledge the Deputy Secretary, Charles. Thanks for your comments, and I think you were exactly right. This is an ongoing dialogue, and it's very healthy that this dialogue is continuing, and obviously we're in very transformative times, and really trying to peer into the future. So I'm gonna go on to show my screen and walk through my presentation, and we'll take now. Just wanted. Yeah, I'm not seeing my slides up yet. If that doesn't work, I think the host can go ahead and put my slides up.
Rocky, your slides are up.
Oh, are they? Oh, okay. Okay, that's just not the view I'm seeing. Okay, I'm sorry. So the first, I'm just introducing myself. TRIP, as you heard, we've been in this is our 50th year actually, and mostly what we do, we're supported by the transportation community organizations across the country, and they look to us to be advocates for a transportation system that's well maintained, that's efficient, reliable, and safe. And we do that by putting out numerous reports. We've put out 8 state reports this year. Next week will be in Oklahoma. So that is really our primary function, is to really communicate the condition of the system. Looking ahead at trends, the first thing that pops out is that the country continues to grow. Over the next 20 years, we're looking at 20 million more, or excuse me, 40 more million people over the next 20 years, a 12% increase. And if you look up to the pandemic, up to 2019, we saw a consistent, particularly from the 2008 period, there was about a 4-year period where due to the economic downturn, travel growth was flat. But since 2014 to 2019, we saw a 7% increase in vehicle travel, just over about 1% a year. If you look at freight movement, trucking, it grew much faster. It increased by 30% from 2000 to 2019. And if you looked at the Federal Highway's latest analysis of the future, again, this is a pre-pandemic analysis, they anticipated that the value of goods shipped would nearly double, and the weight of that would be an increase of about 41%. So a fairly significant increase in travel. Every year, the Federal Highway Administration publishes the latest data on pavement conditions, everything including the interstates to arterials to the collector system, essentially everything outside of neighborhood and small local roads. And at the urban level, those numbers in terms of poor condition, and that's ride quality, that's pavement smoothness, continue to deteriorate. But we recognize that the real measure are more exacting measures of base and sub-base conditions. But obviously, the road smoothness is a good indication of whether state and local governments are able to keep up with the wear and tear in the system. And unfortunately, they haven't been able to. We've seen a very small reduction in the share of bridges that are in poor condition, what we had called structurally deficient in the last couple of years, but essentially it means that the engineers in inspection note the need for significant repairs. The challenge is nearly half of the bridges are over 50 years old. Engineers point out that while a bridge built today is built to last 75 to 100 years, bridges built 50, 60, and 70 years ago just didn't have access to the type of techniques and materials we use now, and those bridges can only be kept open for so long before they need to be rebuilt or some cases replaced. Traffic fatalities are this very frustrating challenge. 5 or 6 years ago, it looked like these numbers were starting to drop, but they stubbornly have stayed around in the same range over the last several years, averaging nearly 37,000 from 2014 to 2019. And it's critical to point out that about a fifth of those across the country are pedestrian and bicyclists. Probably about 80% of that number is pedestrians. And those numbers are a huge challenge, and their share, although it's been fairly even over the last 5 years, there's a lot of concern could increase. And then INRIX, which does a lot of analysis based on cell phone movement, based on their 2020 data, and obviously the report points out that with the COVID pandemic, it was a very different reality out there, still found that 12 out of the 100 most congested urban areas are in the country. TRIP does an analysis looking at, based on a variety of reports and studies, what happens to vehicle operating once pavements get worse. And essentially what happens is the worse the condition the roads are in, the vehicle deteriorates that much more quickly. And that's about half of the cost. And we estimate that's around $135 billion annually, 596 per driver. The White House just put out a 50-state report that included that estimate per state. The Texas Transportation Institute estimates that traffic congestion costs in terms of the value of lost time to passengers and freight and the additional fuel burned is $176 billion. And based on National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates, the annual economic cost of serious and fatal traffic crashes is over $100 billion a year. And AAA did a tremendous report in 2017 where they took a look at the long-term needs to improve safety and documented that about $1 billion annually spent on highways, or $1 billion spent on highway improvements over 20 years would save 440 lives. So we have some real significant needs there. The report that came out last year to Congress looked at what's the current backlog to get out there and repair everything that needs to be fixed. As you can see, that's well over $700. It's around $800 billion for road and bridge rehabilitation, and about over $200 billion for projects needed to modernize the transportation system, for adding additional capacity. And then the final part relates to the previous slide. The AAA Safety Foundation found the total safety backlog of needed improvements is around $146 billion. Congress in 2015, when they passed the current surface transportation bill, asked that a report be done through the National Academy of Sciences by the Transportation Research Board that looked at what do we need to do to have the interstate system we're going to need, going through this century. The report found that there's a persistent and growing backlog of physical and operational deficiencies. What they pointed out was that the routine repairs, whether it was to pavements, but also this would also be true of bridges, there was a point of diminishing returns, and most of these interstate segments we had reached that the additional overlays, the simple repavings were lasting less and less because the subbase and base crumbling that was occurring, we had really reached the point where we need to start to reconstruct the system. They also talked about modernizing the interstate system, and really that was several things. In addition to safety improvements, it was certainly adding some capacity along congested corridors. It was adding some additional segments that I-69's slow construction is an example of that. They also talked about it at the urban level, that there would be a need for further modifications of the system, recognizing that there had been a lot of dislocation socially and economically from the interstate system that was largely designed and built in the 1950s and 60s. So I think that was an important acknowledgement. We've certainly seen the Biden administration also pointing out that need to take a look at the system that was built largely 50 and 60 years ago, and making sure that while we remain connectivity to support the economy and people in that community, but we also find a way to lessen the damage that may have been caused or provide that mobility in a way that fits better within that community. Achieving those goals is going to require more than a doubling of the current investment in the interstate system, and really I think that's true. As you go across the country, and not just on the interstate system. We talked about trucking, and 49 out of 50 of the worst freight bottlenecks in the country are on the interstate system. We talked about the growth in overall VMT. Well, trucked VMT, miles of travel on the interstate system, grew 45% from 2000 to 2019. So that really gives you a sense of how heavily traveled our transportation system in terms of freight. The Department of Transportation looked ahead to 2045 on national highway system routes, obviously the interstate being the key to them. And you can see where the red highly congested sections are, which is pretty much all of the highly populated parts of the country. That's the future that we're headed towards, unless we can make our system more reliable. The last time we had this conference, and I spoke at the webinar, was April of last year. Obviously, COVID had just started, and we were just dealing with this tremendous change in our lives, and I'm not really sure what the long-term implications are. So I'm going to conclude with a few slides that start to discuss that area. Obviously, you can see from this slide, from the U.S. Department of Transportation, we saw this tremendous drop in all modes. The passenger vehicle mode did not drop as far and also recovered more quickly. And if we advance that to just now look at passenger vehicle and freight, as you can see, freight at a time where e-commerce went through the roof has recovered back to by January back to the same levels it was before the pandemic. Vehicle travel is around 11% below the level of travel before COVID, although as you would expect that varies by which state that you're looking at the data. Inrix, in the report that I mentioned earlier, put out this very fascinating chart on congested hours, and it might be a little complicated to grasp all this quickly, and you can get this presentation again from our host, but essentially what the curve shows is that the morning rush hour has dropped significantly through the pandemic. We've actually seen sort of the emergence, if you will, of a bit of a midday rush hour, which again would make sense given a lot of people are at home, and that's probably when they are doing a lot of their errands, and a reduction in evening rush hours, but not to the same level. And so I think all of us are looking at this data. I think the question's been asked that with the future of transportation really in flux, is it the right time to be making transformational decisions in terms of too many caveats on the use of transportation funds? And I think that's a critical question. The need for a significant boost in surface transportation funding, I think, is obvious. But I also think we need the flexibility to make sure that the money is used wisely. And here's my final slide. It comes from a U.S. Department of Transportation presentation from last fall, and really looking behind that. And basically what they've looked at in this slide is a number of factors that are going to impact future transportation use. One, obviously, the tremendous growth in e-commerce. That may slow down a little bit, but I think most people anticipate that level of e-commerce is probably here to stay. Working from home went from 5% to well over 35% at the height of the pandemic. I think most people think that's going to come down somewhat, but I think we're obviously in a different era of where and how people work. Businesses obviously essentially cut out business travel through the pandemic. I think most analysts suspect that while business travel will come back, will probably not to the level it once was. Certainly during the pandemic, people were quite averse to shared transportation options. You would anticipate that it's going to lessen somewhat as we start to get through this, as more people receive vaccines, but again, likely to still have long-term impacts on the way people view what transportation options they prefer. Some suggestion that short-term trips, short aviation trips may switch over to vehicle trips. Certainly we see modal shifts for commuters. And then the final one is population dispersal. There's certainly a lot of evidence that people are seeing the growth, which had been more to central cities at the earlier part of last decade, by the middle decade was switching in a more suburban direction. And this pandemic seems to have accelerated that trend. And also we see rents dropping in high density, large urban areas, largely coastal areas, and actually increasing in mid-sized cities. Obviously, these trends are still to play out. We're going to learn more about them. And I think that's why moving forward, I think as the infrastructure bill and reauthorization are debated in Congress, the real discussion will be, we need a significant boost in funding, but let's make sure that we allow state and local governments to capture those resources and use them in the most effective way. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocky, always for your thoughtful and very enjoyable presentations. We thank you for taking the time to spend with us again today. Our next presentation and final will be by Bruce Ullman. And Bruce is the Manager of Applied Sustainability with the BASF Corporation and has worked in the fields of engineering, manufacturing, research and development, and sustainability for over 30 years, and certainly something that figures right into our discussions today. A chemical engineer, Bruce speaks frequently on sustainability and life cycle assessment and has published many articles on these topics and is a member of the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment. He's also a certified LCA practitioner and certified life cycle executive. Thanks, Bruce, for joining us today, and go right ahead.
Thanks, Jim, for the introduction, and happy Earth Day to everyone. Just a sound check that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. So, yeah, pleasure to be here. My presentation today will probably be less of the macro level overview of roads and infrastructure that you heard from Charles and Rocky highlighted, but I think based off that last talk that Rocky gave, I think my presentation segues nicely into that last comment that Rocky made about that our agencies are going to be given a lot of resources, and how can we support them in making the best decisions on how to use those precious resources in the most eco-efficient way, being good from an environmental standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. So I'm going to highlight in my talk today how life cycle assessment can really help us select and support the decision-making by these agencies as what are the right technologies to utilize to repair and maintain our roads. As I said, being good stewards to the environment as well as to our pocketbooks here. So a little bit of an introduction real briefly to BASF, the company that I work for. So our purpose is we create chemistry for a sustainable future. It really defines what we do and why we do it. And we really want to contribute to a world that provides a viable future, a great infrastructure, and a great enhanced quality of life to everyone today and in the future. And we impact almost 90,000 customers in almost every market sector, including transportation, in almost every country in the world. So we know that BASF and our customers are going to play a key role in helping us positively respond to these key challenges that you've heard that we're going to be addressing now and in the future as a society, the growing population, climate change. So we need to be a positive enabler and put out those solutions that are really going to help reduce those environmental impacts. So we really, make our purpose more tangible through our corporate commitments. So we need to make sure that we're sourcing our raw materials and our the ingredients that we're using for our solution as responsibly as possible. We want to hold our suppliers to the highest levels of human rights and environmental protection that we have. Within our own operations, we want to make sure that we're using these precious resources as efficiently as possible, but we're also very safe in our operations, safe for the people in our plants, safe for the people that utilize our solutions, but also safe for the environment. But most importantly, as a highlight, we want to drive out those solutions into the marketplace that are really going to make our roads more sustainable, that we need to be able to quantify why these are better solutions and how these are really saving money and reducing environmental impact. And above all these commitments, we want to make sure that we're treating people fairly. Human rights is a core part of our social responsibility. We value diversity, and we really believe that's a great way to spur innovation to come up with these great solutions. But we do face a lot of challenges, and the challenges around sustainability, or the term green. How do we define that? And in this word cloud here, you can see that it has so many different meanings. They can be very specific to where you are in the world, what industry you're in, and even your personal beliefs. But the challenge is that our customers, our stakeholders, state agencies, everybody wants to know more about how we and our companies are really impacting the environment, how our products are helping to save money and reduce environmental impact. But how can we do that? So BASF, we're a very science-based company. So we took these two statements to heart. If we want to really integrate sustainability into our decision making, we need to be able to measure it. If we want to use sustainability to help us innovate and come up with the new great technologies out there that are going to help us, reduce climate change, we need to be able to measure that. So BASF, we came up with a toolbox that enables us to really measure and quantify sustainability. We can do things in measuring sustainability in all three pillars following these science-based tools. So as you can see here on the left, we can understand the environmental impacts of our products through traditional life cycle assessment. We can measure the carbon footprint of products. We can marry that with the total cost of ownership, which is really looking at that life cycle cost that a product is having, not just what you buy it for, what you sell a product for, but what is that total cost of ownership? When you bring both the economics and the environment together, that's an eco-efficiency analysis. And then we develop special tools such as C-Balance and Ag Balance that are very focused on measuring some social environment, social sustainability impacts, and ones that are customized to the agricultural industry. But BASF realizes that these are science-based tools. They need to be credible, so we do follow a lot of the industry standards such as ISO when we implement those. And our tools and methods have been third-party verified so that the results that we get are very credible. So just as a refresher here on what a life cycle assessment is, when we begin to assess, solutions to maintain our roads, we want to make sure that we're covering all three elements of that life cycle, that we're looking all the way back to the cradle where we're extracting all these basic raw materials that we're using. That's called the production phase of our life cycle. But we also want to take a look at the use phase. So we take a look at the performance attributes of roads and some of the technical performance characteristics, say like durability. We want to make sure we capture those because that's a very important part of the life cycle assessment. And then of course, the end of life, whether we're disposing of solutions and products in landfills or we're recovering a lot of our products that we had implemented and recovering those in a circular fashion. We want to make sure that we're capturing the benefits of reutilizing those materials. Well, you want to make sure that when you're measuring these impacts that you do it in a very holistic manner. So from the environmental side, we know that carbon footprint has a lot of notoriety, greenhouse gases, but you want to make sure that you're not just optimizing or making decisions on one metric without looking at the other metrics. There's other water emissions and air emissions. How are we using non-renewable resources and water, land use, and energy consumption? These are very important metrics to be considering in a very holistic manner. So as you measure all this information, it's very important that you communicate in a way that the audience can make decisions from it and that it's easier for them to understand. We can communicate this robust environmental assessments and environmental fingerprints, as you can see here, with the better alternatives having that smaller dimension there, approaching the bottom, the center there where you have 0, with the alternatives that have the higher impact out at the normalized value of 1. Now, we also want to realize that there also is the business case, that it's good to optimize on the environment, but you also need to understand what the total costs of our solutions are. So we integrate that in our eco-efficiency analysis by capturing all traditional cost categories like cost of raw materials and energy and utilities, but we also look at incorporating some non-traditional cost categories such as process efficiencies and disposal costs, durability, and revenue to really get a very comprehensive look at what the total cost of ownership of these solutions are. And in our eco-efficiency analysis, again, like the fingerprint, where we can consolidate all this data into easy to understand graphics, we can report in our eco-efficiency portfolio how the alternatives compared relative to one another. If you're looking at the economic side, going from left to right, you're going from the worst business case to the best business case. So here, the light blue alternatives had the lowest cost of ownership. And if you look at the environmental impact, that's going from the bottom, the highest environmental impact, to the top with the lowest impact. And you really want to drive your solutions to inform your decision-making into that upper right-hand quadrant where alternatives are doing the best of balancing reduced environmental impact with the lowest business case. So let's take a look at the studies that were conducted for eco-efficiency for pavement preservation. So as we know, there are many technologies available for us to maintain and preserve our roads, and many factors can influence this decision-making. But what technology is really best for us, and how do we know what is the right treatment when considering these multiple factors? Well, BSF partnered with a lot of trade associations and our customers around assessing and utilizing eco-efficiency analyses to really bring science into the decision-making. So in 2010 and 11, we completed eco-efficiency studies for chip seal and microsurfacing, and in 2018, we completed an eco-efficiency analysis on a cape seal versus a hot mix alternatives. All these reports and all the details were third-party reviewed by NSF, and they're available on the NSF website and out there in a very transparent manner. So again, what were the benefits of this life cycle assessment? So it really enabled us to have a full accounting of these technologies and pavement preservation solutions over their full life cycle. So in the production phase, we were understanding the impacts of material consumption for binders and aggregates. We were looking at technology differences, whether it was a hot or a cold technology. We were assessing the impacts of transporting all these materials. So it was very comprehensive. But we also looked at the use phase and were able to capture the different durabilities of these solutions. And of course, at the end of life, if we were reutilizing some of the wrap, or using ground tire rubber in these solutions, we were capturing the benefits of that. That's the power of life cycle assessment. It's also a science-based approach, so it is very comprehensive and credible. As I said before, we're following ISO standards for conducting these analyses. We're working with industry rules such as PCRs, and it really now allows us now to assign numbers and values in a credible manner to all these activities. So if we know that we're using less materials, we can assign that to a resource efficiency. If we're working at lower temperatures, we can, through life cycle assessment, see how that's contributing to a lower carbon footprint. And another power of that eco-efficiency analysis in this holistic view, it enables us to look past just that carbon footprint, because as the studies have shown, other environmental indicators such as resource depletion, acidification potential are very important environmental metrics when assessing the environmental impacts that we're having for our roads and reducing those environmental impacts. But it also enables us to look at things in a very balanced manner. You know, we can understand benefits and trade-offs, and thus understand where the hot spots are. So if we look to innovate and reduce our impacts for our operations, we know where to target. So once again, here are the results for the studies that we've done, a very highlighted overview. So if you look at the microsurfacing eco-efficiency analysis that was done, which compared it against a mill and fill, which is the hot alternative, you can see in the upper left-hand corner there the environmental footprint. So the microsurfacing, that green alternative there, really had the lowest environmental impacts in all the environmental indicators when looking at that full life cycle of preserving and maintaining a road for over 40 years. You can see in the eco-efficiency as well, the green alternative for microsurfacing also showed that it had both the best business case of reduced economic impacts, but also the lowest environmental impacts. And what were the reasons for really showing this eco-efficiency for microsurfacing? Well, really, it was using less material over those 40 years, less energy intensive, and also it was had less time to apply, which had some also social and economic benefits, less disruptions to the roads, and overall the lower total cost of ownership. So overall, the study showed that it clearly had, for the microsurfacing, the lowest environmental and economic impacts versus the hot alternative. But we also realized to communicate this to the people who are going to make decisions, that we needed to communicate those results in environmental equivalency, some way that people can more tangibly understand the environmental benefits here. So we could translate say the energy savings into the amount of barrels of oils, or equivalating that to the energies that are consumed in a US home. Or if we're looking at a carbon footprint savings, we can equate that to, you know, acres of forests that would have that similar CO2 sequestration. So as we've seen, we need to take the complexity of these LCAs and communicate those in more tangible equivalencies. The other study we looked at was a Cape Seal study. And we can see here that the two Cape Seal technologies compared against a hot mix overlay. This study was done more in a later time frame, 2018, compared to the microsurfacing. So we had different durabilities, different assumptions going into the assessment, but still the Cape Seal pavement preservation technology showed a much lower carbon footprint than the hot mix alternative. When you look at comparing all those environmental metrics together, you can see the Cape Seal 2 technology, which is really using this polymer modified microsurfacing overlay, had the lowest overall environmental impact compared to the hot mix overlay. When you compare that here to the eco-efficiency portfolio, you can see the two pavement preservation technologies here had the much lower economic impact, but also a lower environmental impact than the hot alternative. But LCA also provides us the opportunity to run sensitivity analyses around some of these key assumptions. We were able to look at the sensitivity of, saying, reducing temperatures for the hot mix alternative. And even through those sensitivity analyses, we were able to show that the polymer modified Cape Seal was still the most eco-efficient when we challenged some of those assumptions that we made about production temperatures, or even the amount of recycled asphalt pavement that could go back into those alternatives. So it's a very powerful tool that enables you and support those decision making. So really, what was our high level learnings from these life cycle assessments? That really processes that are more energy intensive, require more heat, and more material over their lifetime will be less eco-efficient, and pavement preservation really does the best at balancing low energy intensities with less material, but still maintaining that road performance over those 40 years. So they really truly are the most eco-efficient of those solutions because it does balance both of those pillars of sustainability. LCAs really need to be dynamic because they help us in really adjusting our assumptions to help us really interpret the results of the studies better. And we can also spur innovation. We can see where the hotspots are, and we can utilize that to drive down our environmental impacts, whether it's through enhanced durability, increasing the recycled asphalt pavement that could be included in these alternatives, or reductions in temperatures. But to make these and to help inform our agencies to make the right decision makings, these should be very transparent. They should have third-party critical reviews, and we should communicate those results in tangible ways that it's not so robust in science and metrics and units that are confusing, but we can use tangible equivalencies such as trees planted or energies from our homes to make them more relatable here. So LCA is a very powerful tool that I think is really going to help support the industry and state agencies in really making the best informed decisions about how to use these precious resources to protect our roads and making sure that we have green roads in the future. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to present today, and I'll turn it back for our Q&A session.
Thank you, Bruce, for those especially appropriate comments for Earth Day. And now we'll turn it back to Ann for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We'll now answer any questions. We have a few that have been submitted already. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to submit those using the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Looks like the first question that we have that just came in is for Rocky. With the current tab at $435 billion for rehabilitation due to crumbling base in the roadway, doesn't this seem to reinforce the need for more and earlier pavement preservation intervention as these pavements begin to deteriorate?
You know, that's certainly true. And if you look at the interstate report, I thought, you know, among many, really strong conclusions, one was pointing out that if you don't have in place the strong base underneath that road surface, you see the impacts, and it thwarts long-term pavement preservation. And so really you've got the challenge that your life cycle costs are reduced if you use pavement preservation techniques, but you have a significant part of your system that largely needs to be rebuilt. So moving forward, you can use those techniques.
Thank you. This next question is for anyone who is on the panel. And they said, it seems that we can agree that roads and bridges need repair. So what are some of the challenges that we're facing that prevent us from finding consensus on how to pay for those repairs?
Well, if you look first at the national level, I think certainly you're seeing tremendous interest, both from the administration and Congress, a significant increase in road and bridge, highway transportation investment, also in reauthorization. Ideas on how that's going to be paid for are obviously still being discussed and debated. Certainly for the first time, we're seeing serious discussions of some sort of mileage-based way to start to, at the federal level, at least begin the process of creating the possibility of moving there. If you go to the state level, you see similar discussions. State legislatures recognize the significant need to increase their investment in their transportation system, certainly in their roads and bridges. We saw really starting in 2013, for about the next 5 or 6 years, a number of states, about half of the states, putting in place long-term significant boosts in that funding, largely through user fees, although sometimes it was other recurring sources of revenue that they could use. What we've seen in the last really since the pandemic starts, is states have been willing to shift some money over to transportation, but generally speaking, this legislative cycle, legislatures weren't willing to look at long-term sustainable funding options for the transportation system.
Thank you. This next one is also for anyone on the panel. They said, while equity is not found on any pavement deterioration curve, how can we as an industry strive to meet the challenges it presents?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the last part of that, and I'm not sure if you could just repeat that.
Absolutely. While equity is not found on any pavement deterioration curve, how can we as an industry strive to meet the challenges it presents?
Yeah, I'm wondering if Bruce might also want to, if that's getting into the actual technical aspects.
Yeah, I guess in the term equity, as far as making sure that when we make decisions that we're making it in the most holistic manner, that we look at the social impacts, the environmental impacts, and also the economic impacts that our decisions are having. And I think that lends true to doing things from a very comprehensive manner, like life cycle assessment can help assess and balance all those metrics and trade-offs and where we know the benefits are, so you can actually compare and help inform decision-making when you can see what the environmental impacts are, where we're having impacts from the social pillar of sustainability with those, but also from the environmental side. So I think there are some credible tools that can really help make the equitable decisions in the most fair, transparent, and comprehensive and credible way.
Thank you. Bruce, we just had another one come in specifically for you. They wrote, your analysis was tremendous. Are you seeing agencies in the federal government beginning to analyze the total cost of ownership in terms of money and environmental toll at the level you have?
Yes, I have seen that, and a lot of the some of the resources that we use to support our analyses came from the FHWA and DOT, which have guidance on total cost of ownership and how to do that. I know that we've also been engaged with some other trade associations where we went and presented around the total cost of ownership to government agencies there. So I think it's very important to look at how we can use this precious resource of the monetary part most prudently. So yes, total cost of ownership is being utilized and thought at from a life cycle perspective in the agencies that we've engaged with.
Thank you. Looks like we have just a minute or so left. We'll try to squeeze in one or two more questions. This question is for Rocky, though Bruce, you might have a little bit to add to this as well. With roads costing drivers $135 billion annually and $596 per driver, and the economic impact potentially greater for those lower income families, what's the best strategy to address this problem?
Well, really, I think I went back to some of the earlier comments where if you can move to a pavement preservation model where you're going to use those dollars more effectively, that also provides more dollars for enhancing mobility, which is going to be critical for helping people move up the economic ladder, and finally for improving safety, which impacts all of us.
Thanks, Rocky. Looks like we are just at time now. I just want to say thank you again to Rocky, Charles, and Bruce for participating on today's webinar. We also want to thank Jim Molthrop and FP2 for partnering with PPRA on today's webinar and your continued support. A recording of the webinar will be sent to all registered attendees this afternoon or tomorrow. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.